Tom Bennett's face turned pale the moment the police stepped into the garage office. For a second, no one spoke. The mechanics stopped working. A customer holding a receipt froze beside the counter. Tom looked at me, then at the detectives. And that was the moment I finally understood something terrible. The man who had stood beside me at my husband's funeral was the man who killed him. But the strangest part of this whole story didn't happen that afternoon in the shop. It happened 3 months earlier. The night my phone rang, and the caller ID said my dead husband's name. 3 months after we buried Michael, I was standing in the laundry room folding towels when the phone rang. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. Quiet, cold outside. The kind of night when the air smells faintly like leaves and chimney smoke. Our little house in Hilliard, just outside Columbus, had settled into the stillness that follows dinner. I had the kitchen radio playing softly, an old classic rock station Michael used to listen to while cooking. Creedence Clearwater Revival was on, low volume. My hands were busy folding a bath towel when the phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced over without thinking. Then I froze. The screen said, "Michael Harper." For a moment, my brain refused to process it. Michael Harper was my husband. Michael Harper had died 3 months earlier in a car crash on Interstate 71. I remember staring at the phone like it was some kind of mistake, maybe a scam call, maybe the number got reassigned. People say strange things happen with technology. Still, something about seeing his name there made my chest tighten. The phone kept ringing. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up. My thumb hovered over the green button. "Okay, Linda," I muttered to myself. "It's just a glitch." I answered. "Hello." For a second there was nothing but faint static. Then a voice spoke. Soft, familiar. "Red, please don't hang up." The towel slipped out of my hand. Nobody called me Red except Michael. I gripped the phone tighter. My mouth went dry. "Who is this?" I asked. The voice hesitated for a moment. Then it said something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "You're probably folding laundry right now, in the kitchen. The radio's playing that old station you like." My knees felt weak. That was exactly what I was doing. I swallowed. "Listen," I said carefully. "This isn't funny. My husband passed away. If this is some kind of—" I know the voice interrupted quietly. I know I did. The words landed like a stone in my chest. I leaned against the counter to steady myself. Michael and I had been married 32 years. You learn a person's voice in that time, every little rhythm of it. The voice on the phone sounded just like his. But that was impossible. My heart began pounding. "Who are you?" I whispered. There was a pause. Then the voice said something only Michael would know. "Buckeye Lake, summer of '92. You wore that red sweater and spilled lemonade on the dock." I closed my eyes. That had been our 3rd date. Nobody else was there. Nobody. My mind started racing. Maybe someone had read old emails. Maybe someone hacked something. Maybe grief was making me hear things. The voice spoke again. "Linda, listen carefully." I didn't answer. I could barely breathe. "I didn't die the way they told you." My stomach dropped. What I said. "You need to be careful," the voice continued. "Don't trust someone close to the family." A cold chill slid down my back. "Who?" I asked quickly. "What are you talking about?" But the line went silent. I pulled the phone away and looked at the screen. The call had ended. "Hello," I said again, even though I knew no one could hear me. I stared at the phone for several seconds before hitting the callback button. It rang once, then straight to voicemail. Michael's voice filled the speaker. "Hey, this is Mike Harper. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." I nearly dropped the phone again. That was his voicemail greeting. The same one he'd recorded years ago. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the radio humming softly in the background, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe someone was playing a cruel prank. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But one thought kept circling my mind. Don't trust someone close to the family. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house made me sit up in bed. Around 3 a.m, I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The refrigerator light flickered on bright in the dark room. Michael used to joke that I was the worst sleeper in Ohio. "Brain never shuts off," he'd say. I could almost hear him saying it. The house still felt like his. His boots were by the back door, his coffee mug was in the cupboard. His old Ford truck key still hung on the hook near the garage door. Everything looked normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The next morning I tried to convince myself the phone call meant nothing. Technology does strange things sometimes. Still, the words from that voice wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to drive over to Michael's auto shop in Grove City. The shop sat on a quiet stretch of road just off Broadway. A plain brick building with 3 garage bays and a faded sign that read, Harper and Bennett Auto Repair. Michael and his partner Tom Bennett had owned the place for almost 30 years. Tom had been like family to us. He'd even read the eulogy at Michael's funeral. I pulled into the gravel lot just before 10 in the morning. The garage doors were open. I could hear the familiar sounds of tools and engines. For a moment I just sat in the car. Then I stepped out and walked toward the office. Tom looked up when I entered. "Linda," he said warmly, "good to see you." He came around the counter and gave me a quick hug. "How you holding up?" "Oh, I said. He nodded with the sympathetic expression I'd seen 100 times since the funeral. "Well, you ever need anything, I'm here." I appreciate that. We talked for a few minutes about the shop, business, paperwork, the usual things. Tom seemed normal, calm, friendly. Just the same Tom we'd known for decades. Still, something felt off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe grief makes you suspicious of everything. As I was leaving one of the mechanics, young guy named Danny walked past me carrying a toolbox. He stopped and lowered his voice. "Mrs. Harper." "Yes?" He glanced toward the office, then back at me. "Mike ever tell you he was planning to buy Tom out?" My heart skipped. "What?" Danny shrugged. They'd been arguing about it for weeks. I stared at him. Michael had never mentioned that to me. Not once. I drove home with my mind spinning. That evening I sat at the kitchen table trying to read a book I wasn't really absorbing. The phone rang again. Same time. 7:42 p.m. I didn't hesitate this time. I answered immediately. "Hello." The voice came back. Calm, quiet. "Linda." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you want?" I asked. There was a short pause. Then the voice said 4 words that changed everything. "Storage unit, number 314. I leaned forward. "What storage unit?" "The key's in the red toolbox." "Michael." But the line went dead again. I sat there staring at the phone. Storage unit. Red toolbox. For several minutes I didn't move. Then something clicked in my memory. Michael had kept an old red toolbox in the garage. I stood up slowly, my heart beating harder now. Because suddenly, I had a feeling this strange phone call might not be a prank after all. I stood in the garage for a long time before opening that red toolbox. The garage still smelled like motor oil and cold metal the way it always had when Michael worked on something out there. His old Ford pickup sat in the driveway untouched since the accident. I hadn't had the heart to move it. The red toolbox was exactly where it had always been, on the lower shelf of the workbench. I crouched down and pulled it out. It was heavier than I expected. For a second I just stared at it. My mind kept saying the same thing. "This is crazy, Linda. You're chasing ghosts." But my hands moved anyway. I flipped open the lid. Inside were the usual things Michael kept there: wrenches, spark plugs, a small flashlight. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed something tucked into the corner beneath a folded shop rag. A small brass key. My breath caught. It had a white plastic tag attached to it with faded handwriting. I sat back on my heels, the cold concrete pressing through my jeans. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "Okay, that's strange." But strange didn't mean supernatural. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Michael rented a storage unit for shop equipment. Maybe Tom knew about it. Maybe the call had been from someone who worked with him. Still, something about the whole thing made my stomach feel uneasy. I stood up slowly, holding the key. The garage was quiet except for the faint ticking sound of the wall clock. For the first time since Michael died, I felt something other than grief. I felt a question. The next morning I drove back to Grove City. Not to the shop. To a small storage facility I remembered passing on Stringtown Road. A long row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place people rent when they run out of room in their garage. I almost turned around twice on the way there. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. When I pulled into the lot, the sky was gray and low with clouds. Late November had settled over Ohio in that quiet, damp way that makes everything feel a little heavier. The office door jingled when I stepped inside. A man in his 60s sat behind the desk reading a newspaper. He looked up over his glasses. "Morning." "Morning," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "I'm trying to find out if someone rented a unit here. Michael Harper." The man leaned back in his chair and typed something into his computer. A moment later he nodded. "Unit 314. My pulse quickened. "He rented it about 6 months ago," the man said. "Paid cash for the year." I forced a small smile. "Would you mind letting me take a look? He was my husband." The man studied me for a moment. Then he nodded again. "Sure thing, I'll unlock the gate." A few minutes later I was standing in a long, narrow aisle between rows of metal doors. The wind rattled the tin roof above us. The manager stopped in front of one of the units. "Here you go." He unlocked the door and rolled it halfway up. Inside was a small storage space, maybe 10 by 10 feet. "Take your time," he said, walking back toward the office. The moment he disappeared around the corner, the quiet settled in. I crouched and lifted the metal door the rest of the way. The hinges squealed. Inside the unit were only a few things: a metal toolbox, a cardboard box, and a small gray lockbox sitting on a folding table. The air smelled cold and dusty. I stepped inside slowly. My footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor. For a moment, I just stood there looking around, trying to steady my breathing. "Okay, Mike," I muttered under my breath. "What were you doing?" I walked over to the table. The gray lockbox had a small keyhole. My fingers trembled as I slid the brass key in. The lock clicked open easily. Inside were several envelopes and a flash drive. I pulled out the top envelope. My name was written across the front. Linda. Michael's handwriting. My throat tightened. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short. Read. "If anything ever happens to me, please look at the files in here before trusting anyone. There are things about the shop you deserve to know. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Love you always. Mike." For a moment the words blurred. I had to blink several times before I could read them again. Michael never liked leaving things unsaid. If he wrote this, something must have been seriously wrong. My hands moved to the other envelopes. Inside were printed bank statements, copies of invoices, and email records. At first they looked like ordinary business paperwork. But as I flipped through them, a pattern started to appear. Money transfers. Large ones. Thousands of dollars missing from the shop accounts. Each transfer traced back to a private account under one name. Tom Bennett. I felt the room tilt slightly. "No," I whispered. Tom had been Michael's friend since the early 90s. They built the shop together. He helped Michael when the business nearly went under in 98. Tom had stood beside me at the funeral. He brought soup every Sunday. He hugged me and said we'd get through this. My stomach twisted. I reached for the flash drive. A small laptop sat in the cardboard box beside the table, one of Michael's older ones from the shop. I plugged in the drive and powered the computer on. The screen flickered to life. There was only one file on the drive. An audio recording. My hand hovered over the trackpad. Then I pressed play. At first there was nothing but background noise and engine idling somewhere, maybe the shop. Then voices. Michael's voice. And Tom's. Tom sounded angry. "You should have left it alone," Tom said sharply. Michael answered in a calm, steady tone I recognized instantly. "I gave you chances to fix it." "It's my money too," Tom snapped. "It's the shop's money," Michael said, "and Linda deserves to know what's going on if something happens to me." My breath caught. There was a long pause on the recording. Then Tom's voice came back. Low. Threatening. "You start digging any deeper, Mike, and you're gonna regret it." The recording ended abruptly. The laptop fan hummed quietly in the cold storage unit. For a long time I sat there staring at the screen. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my ears. The voice on the phone had said something that night. Don't trust someone close to the family. Suddenly the words made a terrible kind of sense. I closed the laptop slowly. Then I looked around the empty storage unit. "Michael," I whispered. And for the first time since that phone call, I allowed myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding. What if my husband's death hadn't been an accident? I packed the documents back into the envelope with shaking hands. Because if what I had just heard was true, everything about the last 3 months of my life had been a lie. And the man who might know the truth was the same man who had been bringing me soup every Sunday. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in the car outside the storage facility for nearly 20 minutes with the engine off and the envelope in my lap. Every instinct in me wanted to reject what I'd just seen. Tom Bennett stealing from Michael, threatening him. It didn't fit the man I thought I knew. Tom had been in our lives for more than 30 years. He and Michael met back in 1991 when they were both working at a repair shop outside Grove City. Two stubborn guys in their early 30s who believed they could run a better shop than the boss they had. A year later, they opened Harper and Bennett Auto Repair. I remember those early days clearly. Michael coming home covered in grease, exhausted but smiling. Tom sitting at our kitchen table late at night with invoices spread everywhere while the two of them argued about pricing. Tom was there when Michael and I bought our house in Hilliard. He helped install the water heater when it broke. He stood beside Michael at our 20th anniversary barbecue and gave a speech that made everyone laugh. And 3 months ago, Tom stood in front of a packed church and read Michael's eulogy. His voice cracked when he said Mike Harper was the best man I ever knew. I had believed him. Now I wasn't sure what to believe. The wind rocked the car slightly as another gray cloud rolled overhead. I picked up the envelope again. The documents inside were very real. Numbers, transfers, dates. Thousands of dollars disappearing from the shop accounts over the last 3 years. If Michael had discovered that, he would have confronted Tom. Michael hated dishonesty more than anything. I stared at the steering wheel and whispered, "What happened to you, Mike?" There was only one way to find out. I started the car. The drive back to Grove City felt longer than usual. The shop looked the same as it always had, garage doors open, the smell of oil drifting into the cool afternoon air, a radio somewhere inside playing old country music. But now it didn't feel familiar. It felt different. Like I was walking into a place where something had gone very wrong. Tom looked up from the office desk when I stepped inside. "Linda," he said, surprised. "Back again already." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. "I forgot to ask you something earlier," I said. "Sure." He leaned back in the chair casually. "What's on your mind?" I kept my voice steady. "Did Michael ever mention renting a storage unit?" Tom's expression barely changed. "Barely." But I noticed the hesitation. "Storage unit," he said. "No. Why would he need one?" I shrugged lightly. "I found a key in the garage. Thought maybe it belonged to the shop." Tom shook his head. "Doesn't ring a bell." His tone was calm, easy. But his fingers had stopped tapping on the desk. We sat there for a moment in a strange silence. Then he forced a smile. "Mike always had a dozen little side projects going. Could be anything." "Maybe," I said. A mechanic walked past the office carrying a tire. The radio crackled somewhere in the garage bay. Normal sounds, normal afternoon. Except nothing felt normal anymore. I stood up. "Well, just thought I'd ask." Tom nodded. "You doing okay otherwise?" I hesitated. Then I said some days are harder than others. That part wasn't a lie. Tom's face softened. "Mike loved you a lot, you know." The words landed strangely now. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I know." I turned toward the door. Just as I reached it, Tom spoke again. "Linda." I looked back. "If you ever need help with anything, paperwork, bills, whatever, don't hesitate to call." For a moment our eyes met. I wondered if he knew. If he could somehow see the envelope sitting on the passenger seat of my car. But his expression was impossible to read. "Thanks," I said. Then I walked outside. The cold air hit my face. My hands were shaking slightly as I climbed into the car. The moment the door closed, the weight of everything crashed over me. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. "Okay," I murmured to myself, "think." If Tom had been stealing money, Michael would have confronted him. And if Tom felt threatened? My stomach tightened. No. I forced the thought away. That was a terrible accusation. You don't accuse someone of murder because of one recording. Still, the words from that phone call echoed in my mind. Don't trust someone close to the family. I drove home slowly. That night I spread the documents across the kitchen table. Bank statements. Email printouts. Copies of internal shop records. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Michael had been tracking the missing money. Carefully. Quietly. The emails between him and Tom grew tense over time. At first they sounded professional. Then frustrated. Then angry. The last email from Michael was dated 3 days before the accident. Tom, we need to talk about the account transfers. I'm done ignoring this. If we can't resolve it together, I'll have to involve someone else. That was the final message. 3 nights later, Michael died on Interstate 71 when his truck lost control and crashed into a guardrail. The police report said mechanical failure was likely. At the time, no one questioned it. Now I stared at the papers on the table and felt a slow, creeping dread. Michael had been investigating Tom. And then suddenly he was dead. The house was quiet except for the ticking kitchen clock. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to call the police right then. Another part of me was terrified of being wrong. Tom Bennett had been my friend. He had hugged me at the funeral. He had stood in my kitchen and said, "We'll get through this together." But if the recording was real, and if Michael had discovered something big enough to threaten their partnership, then maybe the accident wasn't an accident. I rubbed my temples. My thoughts were spinning in circles. Then the phone rang. The sound made me jump. I looked at the screen. 7:42 p.m. The same time as the night before. And the same name appeared again. Michael Harper. I picked it up immediately. "Hello," the voice returned. Quiet. Steady. "Linda." My heart pounded. "I found the storage unit," I said quickly. "I saw the documents." There was a brief pause. Then the voice spoke again. "Good. What am I supposed to do now?" I whispered. The answer came calmly. "Look at the truck." "The truck. Brake line." I sat up straight. "What do you mean?" But the line went dead again. I stared at the phone. "Brake line." My mind immediately flashed back to the accident report. Mechanical failure. Slowly, a cold realization began to settle in. If someone had tampered with Michael's truck, then the crash on Interstate 71 might not have been an accident at all. And the person who had the easiest access to that truck worked at Harper and Bennett Auto Repair. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the same thought kept pushing its way back into my mind. Brake line. The voice had said it calmly, almost matter of fact. Look at the truck, brake line. I sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight, staring at Michael's accident report. The paper had been folded so many times the creases were soft now. The report said the same thing the officer told me that night. Loss of control, possible mechanical failure. At the time, I didn't question it. Michael's truck was 12 years old. Things break, that's life. But now, after everything I'd seen in that storage unit, those words felt different. I got up and walked to the back window. Michael's truck was still parked in the driveway under the yellow porch light. A dark blue 2011 Ford F-150. He loved that truck more than he loved most people. He used to joke, "If this thing ever quits on me, bury me with it." The joke suddenly didn't feel funny anymore. I slipped on my coat and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting my nose. A light wind rustled the bare branches of the maple tree near the driveway. For a moment, I just stood there looking at the truck. It looked exactly the same as it had the night Michael drove it to work. I walked around to the front and crouched down near the passenger side wheel. Michael had taught me a few basic things about cars over the years. Not enough to rebuild an engine, but enough to recognize the important parts underneath. The brake line ran along the frame toward the rear wheel. I leaned down and shined the flashlight from my phone under the truck. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. A small section of the metal line looked wrong. There was a clean split in the tubing, not rusted, not worn down. Cut. I sat back slowly on the cold pavement. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like someone was knocking from inside my chest. "No," I whispered. But the evidence was right there in front of me. Someone had cut Michael's brake line. And suddenly the accident on Interstate 71 didn't look like bad luck anymore. It looked like sabotage. I stayed out there for a long time staring at that damaged line. Part of me still wanted to believe there had to be another explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started fitting together in a way that made my stomach twist. Michael had been tracking missing money from the shop. He had confronted Tom about it. He had left evidence in a storage unit. And 3 days later, his truck lost its brakes on the highway. A gust of wind rattled the loose leaves in the driveway. I pushed myself up slowly and went back inside. My hands were shaking as I poured a glass of water. If Tom had really done this, if he had actually killed Michael, then the man who hugged me at the funeral had been lying to my face for 3 months. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m. trying to decide what to do next. Finally, I picked up the phone. The Grove City Police Department answered on the second ring. "Non-emergency line," the dispatcher said. "My name is Linda Harper," I told her. "My husband died in a car accident 3 months ago." There was a pause. "Yes, ma'am." "I think it might not have been an accident." Silence hung on the line for a moment. Then the dispatcher said, "Can you tell me why you believe that?" I took a slow breath and began explaining everything. The storage unit, the financial records, the audio recording, and the cut brake line. By the time I finished, my voice felt dry and thin. The dispatcher asked a few more questions, then said an officer would contact me in the morning. I hung up and leaned back in the chair. The house was quiet again. But something inside me had changed. For 3 months I had been drowning in grief. Now grief had turned into something else. Determination. The next afternoon, 2 detectives came to the house. Detective Aaron Delgado and Detective Susan Klein. They listened carefully while I showed them the documents from the storage unit and played the recording. Neither of them spoke for a long time after the audio ended. Finally, Delgado leaned forward. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, "has anyone else heard this recording?" "Number. Did your husband ever mention being afraid of Mr. Bennett?" I shook my head. "He just seemed stressed lately. I thought it was normal business stuff." Detective Klein flipped through the bank statement slowly. "This is a lot of money," she said. "Almost $200,000 over 3 years," Delgado added. My stomach sank. They exchanged a quiet look. "About the truck," Klein said. "You said you found damage to the brake line." "Yes. We'll need to inspect it ourselves." That evening they towed Michael's truck to the police garage. The next day they called me back. The mechanic confirmed what I had already seen. The brake line had been cut deliberately. Not worn down. Not broken by impact. Cut. Delgado's voice on the phone was calm but serious. "Mrs. Harper, based on what we're seeing, we're reopening your husband's case." My hands trembled slightly as I held the phone. "Do you think Tom did it?" "We don't know yet," he said carefully, "but we'd like to talk to him." A strange feeling settled over me. Part fear. Part relief. For the first time since Michael died, someone else was looking for the truth. 2 days later, Delgado called again. "Linda," he said, using my first name now, "we'd like your help with something." "What kind of help?" "We want to speak with Tom Bennett again, this time with you present." My chest tightened. "You want me there?" "We think he might say more if he believes you're still in the dark." I stared out the kitchen window at the empty driveway. The place where Michael's truck had always been. "You mean, confront him?" "Yes." I thought about the man who had stood beside me at the funeral. The man who brought soup every Sunday. The man who might have murdered my husband. My voice came out steady. "Okay," I said. "Good," Delgado replied. "Tomorrow afternoon, at the shop." When I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long moment in silence. Tomorrow I would face Tom Bennett. And by the end of that conversation, I might finally learn the truth about what really happened on Interstate 71. The next afternoon felt longer than any day I could remember. I woke up before sunrise even though I'd barely slept. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. For a few minutes I just sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty driveway. Michael's truck wasn't there anymore. The police still had it at the garage. That empty space felt strange, like a missing tooth you keep touching with your tongue. I poured a cup of coffee and tried to take a few sips, but my stomach wasn't interested. By noon I was already dressed and pacing around the living room. At one point I caught myself looking at the phone. 7:42 p.m. That was when the calls always came. But the phone had been quiet since the night I spoke to the detectives. Part of me wondered if I would ever hear that voice again. At exactly 2:15 p.m. Detective Delgado's sedan pulled into my driveway. He stepped out along with Detective Klein. "You ready?" Delgado asked. I nodded even though I wasn't sure that was true. The drive to Grove City felt strangely calm. No one said much. The radio stayed off. Traffic moved slowly along the afternoon roads. As we turned onto the familiar street where the shop sat, my chest tightened. The sign still hung above the building. Harper and Bennett Auto Repair. Michael's name was still there. Delgado parked half a block away. "Here's the plan," he said. "You go inside like normal. We'll come in a few minutes later." And say what I asked. Ask Tom about the money, see how he reacts. My mouth felt dry. What if he doesn't say anything? Klein gave a small shrug. Then we ask him ourselves. I took a slow breath and opened the car door. The smell of motor oil and rubber drifted across the lot as I walked toward the garage. Inside the shop looked the same as always. 2 mechanics were working under the hood of a pickup. A customer stood near the counter flipping through a magazine. Tom sat in the office chair with a clipboard. When he saw me, he smiled. "Linda," he said, "didn't expect to see you today." I stepped inside the office. "We need to talk." His smile faded slightly. "Sure," he said. "What's going on?" I closed the office door behind me. The mechanics kept working outside, unaware of the tension that suddenly filled the room. I placed the envelope of documents on the desk. Tom looked down at it. "What's this?" "You tell me." He opened the envelope and started flipping through the papers. For a few seconds his face stayed neutral. Then something changed. Just a small tightening around the eyes. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "Michael rented a storage unit." Tom looked up sharply. "A storage unit?" "Yes." The room felt smaller now. "You want to explain the bank transfers?" I asked quietly. Tom leaned back in the chair. His expression hardened. "Linda, business accounting can look strange if you don't understand it." $200,000 doesn't look strange, I said. "It looks stolen." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I also heard the recording." That stopped him cold. "What recording?" "The one where Michael confronted you." For the first time since I'd known him, Tom Bennett looked nervous. "You went digging into things you shouldn't have," he muttered. Michael was going to go to the police. The words hung in the air between us. Tom slammed the papers onto the desk. He should have kept his mouth shut. The shout echoed into the garage. One of the mechanics looked toward the office. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "You stole from him," I said. Tom's face turned red. "I built that shop too," he snapped. "You think Mike did it all himself? That money wasn't yours." His hands trembled slightly now. "You don't understand what it's like running a business for 30 years. I understand that Michael trusted you." The words came out sharper than I expected. Tom stared at me. For a moment the room went silent except for the distant sound of a wrench clanking on concrete. Then Tom said something that made every hair on my arms stand up. He shouldn't have threatened to expose me. My breath caught. "So you killed him." Tom's eyes widened. "I didn't say that." "But you thought about it." His face twisted with anger. "That idiot was going to destroy everything." The office door opened. Detectives Delgado and Klein stepped inside. Tom Bennett Delgado said calmly, "We need you to stand up." Tom spun toward them. "What the hell is this?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Michael Harper." For a second, nobody moved. The mechanics in the garage stared toward the office. One customer slowly set down his magazine. Tom looked at me, then at the detectives. "You don't have anything on me," he said. Klein held up a folder. "We have the financial records, the recording, and a mechanic's report confirming the brake line on Mr. Harper's truck was cut." Tom's shoulders sagged slightly. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. Delgado stepped forward and placed the handcuffs on his wrists. "You can explain that at the station." The metal cuffs clicked shut. The sound felt louder than anything else in the room. Tom glanced at me one last time. His voice was quiet now. "You should have left it alone, Linda." I didn't answer. The detectives led him through the garage. The mechanic stepped aside as Tom Bennett, the man who had worked beside Michael for 30 years, was walked out in handcuffs. The garage fell silent. For a moment I just stood there. Then I looked up at the faded shop sign through the office window. Harper and Bennett Auto Repair. Michael's name still stood first. And finally, the truth about what happened to him was no longer hidden. Tom Bennett was charged with first-degree murder 3 weeks later. The investigation moved faster than I expected once the truth started coming out. The financial records from the storage unit, the recording Michael had made, and the brake line inspection all pointed in the same direction. Tom had been quietly moving money out of the shop accounts for years. At first the amounts were small, then they got bigger. When Michael finally noticed, he confronted him. The detectives later told me Tom admitted most of it during questioning. Not the murder part right away, but the money, yes. According to him, Michael threatened to report the theft and force him out of the business. Tom panicked. One evening after closing the shop, he went into the garage where Michael's truck was parked and cut the brake line. He assumed the failure would look like normal wear on an old vehicle. And at first, it did. The crash happened late at night on Interstate 71. By the time investigators arrived, the truck was badly damaged. No one suspected anything. Not the police. Not the mechanics. Not even me. For 3 months, I believed the accident had simply taken my husband away. The trial happened the following spring. I attended every day. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and coffee from the hallway vending machines. The same handful of reporters showed up most mornings quietly typing notes. Tom sat at the defense table looking older than I remembered. Thinner. Gray around the edges. Once or twice our eyes met across the room. But neither of us spoke. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. When the judge read the verdict, I didn't cry. I thought I would. Instead, I just felt quiet. Like a long storm had finally moved past. The shop closed a month later. I sold the building and the equipment to another repair company in Grove City. They kept most of the mechanics on staff, which felt right. Michael always cared about the people who worked there. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after the trial. Grief doesn't work that way. But slowly the house started feeling less heavy. The radio still played in the kitchen most mornings. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for 2 coffee mugs instead of 1. Old habits take time to fade. One evening about 6 months after the trial ended, I sat down at the kitchen table with my phone. I had been sorting through paperwork and finally decided to check something that had been bothering me. The call logs. Those strange calls from Michael's number. I opened the phone record history and looked through the dates. There were 3 calls. All at the same time in the evening. 7:42 p.m. The same name attached to each one. Michael Harper. But when I contacted the phone company the following week, the technician sounded confused. That number hasn't been active since the day of the accident, he told me. So, no calls could have come from it. Not unless the account was reactivated, he said. And it wasn't. I sat quietly after hanging up the phone. For a long time I stared at the kitchen wall where Michael used to hang the shop calendar every January. Maybe there was some technical explanation. Maybe the records were wrong. Maybe grief had played tricks on my memory. But I knew what I had heard. That voice on the phone. Calm. Familiar. Guiding me toward the truth. A gentle breeze drifted through the open kitchen window. The radio softly played an old Creedence Clearwater Revival song Michael used to love. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the streetlights flickered on as evening settled over the neighborhood. I thought about the strange path the last year had taken. The loss. The betrayal. The justice that finally followed. And those 3 phone calls. I still don't know exactly how to explain them. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that somehow, the truth found its way to the surface. And Michael deserved that. If this story stayed with you, I'd really like to hear what you think. Have you ever experienced something in life that you simply couldn't explain? If you'd like to share, feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoy stories like this, you're always welcome to come back for the next one. Thank you for listening.